We really appreciate you being here. Thank you. And we're trying to ask people to wear masks unless you're speaking. We're looking for a second microphone for the question and answer later. If we don't have it, we'll go with the flow. Rules. Remember to validate your parking tickets, first of all. That's not a rule, it's just a suggestion. There is a basket for contributions if you would like to make a contribution towards some of our costs. We also have information about next month. And here are the ground rules. Our purpose is to gather together in a setting where challenging and complex current cultural and religious faith issues are presented, shared, and discussed. We are not here to judge, but rather to create a safe space for significant conversation. Please be respectful of others and the views they express. There will be a presentation of 45 minutes to an hour, which for a former Baptist is no problem. The remainder of our time will be used for questions and comments. Although we want to encourage good discussion, please do not dominate the conversation to a point where others are unable to share their thoughts. Please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone if you have one. If not, I'll point to you. Please don't shout out. We'll try to give everyone a chance to speak so you can ask your question or make your comment. We believe if we can hold to this format, everyone will leave here enriched. We'd also like to thank the Doubletree again for the generosity in offering us this venue free of charge. And it's a great gift. We love the people who work here. And if you'd like to order something, please do so. We have someone here doing that, and please tip your server well. So now I'd like to introduce the very Reverend Dr. Robert Stewart the 15th, who will introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thank you, Dr. Onsman. In case you don't know where to validate your parking ticket, go to the front desk. It's my distinct honor to introduce our speaker for the evening, Dr. Carey, Professor of New Testament at Lancaster Theological Seminary, holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Rhodes College, a Master of Divinity from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a Master of Arts and a PhD from Vanderbilt University. He has been Professor of New Testament at Lancaster Theological Seminary since 1999. He is a prolific writer. His published works include Using Our Outside Voice, Public Biblical Interpretation, and Faithful and True, a study guide to the book of Revelation. He has authored 9 books and 10 articles. He has appeared on BBC, PBS, the Discovery Channel, and the History Channel, and has frequently contributed to the Christian Century and the Huffington Post. He fields media interviews regarding biblical studies and the interface of contemporary Christianity and politics. Perhaps the most impressive thing Greg has accomplished is playing Harding Park Golf Course in San Francisco, where the 2020 PGA Championship was played. He didn't play in that championship, by the way, but he has a hat to prove that he played there. Please welcome my friend and golfing partner, Dr. Greg Carey.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you for coming out. Quite a few friends that I haven't seen since the before times, right? And our topic tonight involves a subject that is important to me. I hope it's of value to you, Christian nationalism. And I address this topic because I'm not neutral in speaking about it. I think that we're living in times that are extremely dangerous for democracy in the United States and a lot of other places. And I've become convinced that Christian nationalism and the way Christianity is playing out in the United States is part of the threat to democracy. In other words, it's not just a religion thing, but it's a public thing. Lots of folks aren't aware of what Christian nationalism means and how it works in our public life. And so that's what I'd really like to talk about. I'll talk a little about the history of the movement, a little about how it came to be the way it is now, and then a lot about some of the current research that's going on that I don't do, but I keep up with, on why we should be concerned with how Christian nationalism feeds into our public life. And so I'm grateful that you're here. I'm going to see if I've got this figured out. Not that. Yay. So, why start here? You may remember the moment. It was 2020. Black Lives Matter protests were in Washington. They were loud. The National Guard had been called out. And then President Donald Trump left the White House, had the streets cleared by National Guard and security folks, and walks over to St. John's Episcopal Church and holds up a Bible, points to it and holds it up. Why choose this image as a way into the conversation? Well, this wasn't his Bible. I mean, the White House at the time was his house, but he had to borrow a Bible. If it's so important, right, you might have one. It was Ivanka's Bible. Donald Trump is famous for not knowing the contents of the Bible. When he's been asked, well, tell us about a Bible passage that you like, his response was, and he's good at it, all of them. I love the whole thing, yeah? The church and the Episcopal Diocese condemned his use of their space for a photo op at a politically charged moment. And who holds a Bible like that? Or the other ways he held it, if you remember that moment on the news. It was a prop. And the point I'm interested in making isn't a partisan point, but it needs to be said that part of the context for this moment involved race, right? What he's doing is he's using the Bible to legitimate his efforts to stifle protest for racial justice for Black Americans. And race is a part of what we have to talk about when we talk about Christian nationalism. Using the Bible to affirm his authority in a context of racial conflict. So, what is Christian nationalism? I had this going. We'll just have to move around. The journalist Catherine Stewart gave a definition that I find helpful. Christian nationalism, she writes, is the idea that the United States is and ought to be a Christian nation, which is not new, right? And hasn't always been super controversial, though it is now. And the reason it's super controversial is the second part of her definition. Governed under a reactionary understanding of Christian values. What she means is, it's not simply an affirmation that there's a strong stream of Christianity in the flow of the United States, its culture and history, but that a particular narrow strand of Christianity, white Christian fundamentalism, should hold authority over public affairs in the nation. That's the distinctive part. As I said before, I'm not trained in this study. I became interested when a particular conference came to Lancaster about 11 years ago. One of my friends from my hometown, we couldn't have been closer. He played quarterback, I played center, that close. And we went to seminary together. Called me to say he was coming to Nashville for this event, and I thought, I teach at a seminary 1.3 miles away. How do I not know? 5,000 people were there. And I left scared and starting to do what I call secondary research, right? Reading the people who do research. Let's imagine, I'm going to give this one more shot. Let's imagine before we get into more details, what Christian nationalism looks and sounds like. Josh Mandel is running for Senate in the state of Ohio. He currently holds a statewide office in Ohio, so he's not a minor candidate. He is not a Christian, he's Jewish. And he recently said, "I do not believe in separation of church and state. There is no such thing. The founders of this country, the founding fathers, they did not believe in the separation of church and state. When you read the United States Constitution, nowhere do you read about the separation of church and state. It does not exist." I'm not here to debate the history and interpretation of the First Amendment in the Supreme Court. Simply to point out that what he's trying to affirm is that affairs of state and affairs of church rightfully should be intertwined. And then the question should always be, what should that look like? Like when you say church, what does church mean? And how does it influence state? So down the turnpike, I like to think he's a friend. But John Thea teaches history at Messiah College. How many of you are familiar with John? You see him pretty often on the news. John wrote a book several years ago called "Was America Founded as a Christian Nation?" John is a conservative evangelical. He's a terrific historian. And his argument essentially is, it's complicated, right? I mean, there's not a single one-size-fits-all answer to this. If you ask, well, who settled in Plymouth Bay? They were trying to establish a Christian light on a hill, right? They had explicit Christian motivations. If you ask about the folks who moved into the James River plantation, not so much. They were looking for a place to farm. If you talk about folks who settled the Carolinas or Georgia, right, you're going to get different answers. If you ask about the folks who framed, wrote, signed the Constitution, very diverse. Some very devout, church-going Christian people. Lots of people who talked about God but didn't much go to church. Some people who we wouldn't identify as Christians. They would have identified as deists, right? Someone like Thomas Jefferson, who's about as big as it gets, really liked Jesus. He liked Jesus so much that he cut up the Gospels so that he would only have the Jesus he liked. So, was America founded as a Christian nation? That argument has always been in the stream, right? It's always kind of been there. We've always, had chaplains. We've always had prayers at public events. There's always been sort of what we would call civil religion, a deference to religion. But the point of that, up until not long ago, was that civil religion was kind of contentless, right? It wasn't denominational, it wasn't sectarian, it wasn't doctrinal. It was just, we like God, especially for Jews and Christians, and good, we can all identify with those things. But Christian nationalism is a little different. And I think the stream of that history as we kind of experience it today goes back to earlier in the 20th century. I'm fine. Early in the 20th century, after World War I, with the Great Depression and after the Great Depression, we had a series of what we might call Red Scares in the United States. After World War I, labor movements started springing up, some of them influenced by Marxist theory, and there was sort of a backlash against that. Sometimes it got violent, with automatic weapons and trained and hired assassins and all of that. After World War II, of course, it was a more serious thing because you had the Soviet Union and folks had figured out what the Soviet Union was. And so there was a reaction to a perceived threat of communism, godless communism, taking over the United States. One of the leading ministers in that movement, I was surprised to learn, being a member of the United Church of Christ and teaching in a United Church of Christ seminary, was the pastor of First Congregational Church, Los Angeles, James Fifield. And he had lots of corporate sponsors for his public voice. There was an organized corporate effort to fund Christian movements that would promote Christianity as an antidote to communism. So, as a New Testament scholar with some interest in theology, I'm fascinated by something that Fifield said. The way out for America is not ahead, but back. How far back? Back as far as the old gospel, which exalted individuals. I didn't know that. Which placed responsibility for thought on individuals, and which insisted that individuals should be free spirits under God. I haven't been able to find the passage. He also said every Christian should oppose the totalitarian trends of the New Deal. So what you're beginning to get in this moment is, with the perceived threat of communism and the perceived threat of a kind of new social arrangement like the New Deal, how do we push back against that? We begin to argue that those movements are godless. I mean, we're hearing these same arguments today. That those movements are godless, communistic, and the best antidote is to get the right Jesus into the equation, right? I'm just tracking some moments, not being a historian, but we might think, for example, in the 1950s of the founding of the National Prayer Breakfast. More and more research has been done on the National Prayer Breakfast. It is a thoroughly right-wing, sectarian organization that sponsors it, but they've been incredibly successful in packaging it as not sectarian. So presidents from every party wind up going to the National Prayer Breakfast most years. It's not super partisan event, though, lately. And the idea has been to cultivate this union of conservative business leaders with politicians who will pursue their agenda in a certain way. National Prayer Breakfast, 1953. God in the Pledge of Allegiance, I believe 1954, right? Beginning to track this reaction, really a reaction to the Cold War. For me, it wasn't Bob, it was Steve. Couldn't help but mention, both of you got it in, that my background is Baptist. I, as a 14-year-old, asked Jesus into my heart and was baptized at First Baptist Church, Florence, Alabama. And I have Southern Baptist credentials about as good as Paul's Pharisaic credentials. I was president of the youth group. I was president of the Baptist Student Union in college. I worked for the Southern Baptist Convention for 2 years and got a degree from a Southern Baptist seminary. And one of the things that has shocked me, so we're talking about a period from like 1979 to 1992, would cover that period of my life, is how much Southern Baptists have changed. How much they've changed. Historian named Andrew Lewis talks about a Baptist organization called the Baptist Joint Committee on Public Affairs, which I remember from high school. It networks of Baptist denominations fund this agency in Washington, D.C., and the purpose of... And then, in the 80s or 90s, they pulled out of the Baptist Joint Committee and started their own agency to promote Christian nationalism. Lewis writes, despite some criticism, from the 1940s to the 1970s, the Southern Baptist Convention approved of the Baptist Joint Committee and the Supreme Court's separationist positions. In 10 of 25 annual conventions from 1947 to 72, Southern Baptists passed resolutions opposing the use of public funds to support religious schools, hospitals, and other institutions. What changed? I'll add that when I was in college, I did a research project on Southern Baptists and race, and found that during this period up until the mid-1970s, Southern Baptists passed multiple, not many, a few, resolutions at the national level supporting reproductive choice. So, what happened? Well, some of you are ready to tell the story for me, and you don't need me to, or part of it. I think there's a part you won't be as familiar with. One part, you'll remember Jerry Falwell, the Moral Majority, Ralph Reed, the Christian Coalition, Pat Robertson, Pat Buchanan. You can begin to name the names. A resurgence of right-wing Christian activism, Christian nationalism. That started in the late 60s. It really began to catch national attention in the 70s. And Jimmy Carter, who was Southern Baptist, right? They got out of the White House in 1980. But there's another movement, the one I encountered in Lancaster 11 years ago, that you might not know about, or I don't find many people who do, called the New Apostolic Reformation, or sometimes they call themselves Network Christianity. The New Apostolic Reformation is a legitimately new development. Not new today, it has its roots in the 70s. But the idea, it comes out of more charismatic Pentecostal streams of Christianity. The idea is that individual preachers have the anointing of prophecy. They receive messages direct from God. And they become apostles. They go out and perform miracles. And what makes the movement distinct is that they network with each other. They align together so that they all work together. When you think about the pictures of the Christian leaders who would go to the White House during Donald Trump's presidency, you would have old religious right people like Robert Jeffries from First Baptist Dallas, a church that used to have 27,000 members, right, on one campus. Old religious right folks. And Paula White, right, who's casting out demons from people who oppose Donald Trump and saying that he's been anointed to serve as president. That both of those people, when I was a kid, would not have been in the same room. And now they are. When you think about the New Apostolic Reformation, folks who are associated with it, do you remember the prayer service at Sarah Palin's church? Michelle Bachman, Ted Cruz, not minor political figures in our national landscape over the past few years. One of their leaders, a guy named Lance Wellnow, I just saw this on Facebook the other day, was advertising his broadcast, Is America in the Bible? Coming up on today's podcast, we're talking about Jesus' 2,000-year-old prophecy about Israel, what's happening in Canada, Cyrus Trump, which is Trump as kind of a messiah, the heralds of disinformation, and more. What scared me when I encountered the New Apostolic Reformation the first time was they were talking about how Christians are called to take dominion, and they mean Christians like them, to take dominion over what they call the 7 mountains of culture. Google it. Religion, family, education, government, media, art, and business. Take dominion is the idea. So why I'm scared is there's no democracy in that, right? Dominion and democracy don't merge well. So I'm not going to tell you how I get it, but I get the magazine of a local Christian school in Lancaster. It's pretty spiffy. And every issue is about Christian nationalism. It's not about Christian doctrine. It's not about ministry. It's about Christian, every issue. The most recent one that I've gotten my hands on, the cover is Restore Education, Restore America. And so I turned to the big article, Restore Education, started reading, and the first and really the topic of the article is Christians should oppose critical race theory. And I thought, how odd that they noticed Christian race theory, critical race theory, the same time Fox News discovered critical race theory. How odd, right? How odd that this issue would be considered a theological issue rather than a political issue. Like there would be a Christian take on how schools should address the question of race. This spring, they have a big fundraiser, and I know people who go to it. They have Charlie Kirk speaking, who was, until Jerry Falwell Jr. had to leave Liberty University, the head of the Falkirk Center at Liberty University. He is a Christian nationalist, national speaker. You'll see him, if you pay attention to certain parts of the news, all the time. Now, see, what's happening is you have groups of people who are creating a whole ecosystem for young people to grow up and families to be involved, where this is the message they hear in their textbooks and in their church curriculum and in their worship services and in their media and their music. And I'm just going to say it, I'm not neutral on this, but because I've been in that world, I know I'm telling you the truth. If the right person lies to them, they believe it. Because it's all about the sources of authority you trust. A historian at Columbia University named Randall Ballmer, who is an evangelical, though not much loved in the movement anymore, has, I think, proven that the origins of the religious right don't go back to abortion. They don't go back to the campaign against feminism. They don't go back to the campaign against gay rights. They don't go back to the campaign against LGBTQ persons. They go back to resistance to the civil rights movement. Ballmer describes a meeting he attended in 1980 for influencers in this moral majority movement. And one of the founders of the movement, an activist named Paul Weyrich, he says, "Remember," Weyrich said, "that the religious right did not come together in response to the Roe decision. It wasn't about abortion. No," he insisted. "What got the movement going as a political movement was the attempt on the part of the Internal Revenue Service to rescind the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University because of its racially discriminatory policies, including a ban on interracial dating that the university maintained until, wait for it, 2000. So the IRS says if you're practicing segregation, you can't be tax exempt. And all of a sudden, a lot of Christian institutions, check. I remember, so my dad might be into this stuff. And he lived in Memphis for a long time. And he was ranting and raving. Memphis is a city with racial tension you feel when you go to the grocery store. It's my second home. I went to college there. I worked there. I love Memphis, but you just breathe it. And so he was a little bit ranting and ranting about those people. And I said, "Dad, tell me, all these Christian schools in and around Memphis, do you know when they were founded? 1972, 1973. As soon as the public schools in Memphis integrated, white Christians moved out or started their own schools. So that the school district of Memphis is like 95% students of color and over 85% poor. And you wonder if people are angry. Wonder if people are angry. Those are the Christian schools. This is what I'm convinced, this is what we're talking about. It's why race figures so prominently in our public conversations, why critical race theory is such an enemy, because it gets people riled up. So I've been following a couple of evangelical sociologists, several actually, but two I'm really interested in. Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Carey, who 2 years ago published a book, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. Because people will ask, is this movement Christian? And I'm not going to tell you, Aubrey Hendricks has written a recent book, Christians Against Christianity. Aubrey's a friend, he's a New Testament scholar, he's super smart, and he wants to argue, no, they're not Christian, they're perverting Christianity. What I would like to argue is, yeah, they're Christian, we have to own them. We have to own them. But that doesn't mean we don't have to resist them. And doing what sociologists do, it's not like sociology the way I took it in college. That was interesting. What they do is study, they're statisticians these days, sociologists, and they read tons of survey data. To frame this question, is it Christian, I thought about this that I saw just this week, right? A Christian nationalist tweet image. The church in 2020, sheep with mask. What the church should look. Now, don't we all want to look like this? Not like that. Right? Christians should be powerful, fierce, on the prowl. Funny, I study Revelation in my research, and I remember this passage where John's in heaven and he hears that there's going to be this lion who comes, and this lion's going to fix everything, and there's no lion. Jesus appears as a lamb, and is a lamb throughout the book of Revelation. Right? So you have interpretations of what power should look like that are being contested, and Christian nationalism is in that conversation. So, to study, Whitehead and Carey identified it, I'm going to be really quick about this, 6 questions you can use to identify, they argued, whether someone or how much someone is a Christian nationalist. You get from 1 to 4 points for each question, so you can score up to 24 points. Right? The federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. You get a 4 for saying absolutely. Right? The federal government should advocate Christian values. A 4 for absolutely. The federal government should enforce strict separation of church and state. 0. Right? If you say absolutely. The federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces. 4, right? The success of the United States is part of God's plan. The federal government should allow prayer in public schools. It does, but anyway. So I guess, if I pull this, am I going to be... Oh!
You're good.
Because this is going to move fast. What they found is that as people respond to these questions, they begin to notice patterns that identify social attitudes that correlate, this is sociologists talk, correlate only with Christian nationalism. They don't correlate with being Christian. They don't correlate with being religious, that is, showing up in services a lot. They don't correlate with being conservative. They don't correlate with being white. They don't correlate with anything else as much as they do with Christian nationalism. Okay? This one is, do you think voting is a right or a privilege? And you see the line is pretty much, this is a trend. And the 24s are all the way here, right? Who up about 50% of people who score at the high end on the Christian nationalist scale say voting is a privilege, not a right. In other words, you can take it away from people. At the other end of the scale, you're down around 10%, and the more strongly Christian nationalistic people are, the stronger the correlation, right? If you have an opinion, and your opinion on a matter of public knowledge, and your opinion is wrong, this is a fascinating question, and you're wrong, how sure are you that you're right? They call this dogmatism. Being sure you're right, regardless of whether you're right or not. That's fascinating. And then I'm going to speed up a little bit. They argue Christian nationalism often influences Americans' opinions and behaviors in the exact opposite direction than traditional religious involvement does. There's some conflicting data on this, but what they're saying is Christian nationalism doesn't mean you're more religious. Recent survey data showed that in the last 5 years, the number of people who identify as evangelicals in the United States has gone up, which is hasn't been the trend until about the last 5 years. However, a high percentage of those people who identified as evangelicals don't go to church. In other words, evangelical is an identity, not a religious experience. When I would have identified as an evangelical, it would have been, I asked Jesus into my heart, he came into my heart, and so I'm telling everybody. That's what made an evangelical, right? Now it means other markers of identity. So, folks who come across as Christian nationalists are more likely to approve of authoritarian tactics like demanding that people show respect for national symptoms and symbols and traditions. Flags, crosses, the military, Christmas, right? I dodged the draft in the war on Christmas. Folks, that was my best line. Folks who come across as Christian nationalists are more likely to fear and distrust religious minorities, Muslims, atheists, Jews. They're more likely to condone police violence toward black Americans and distrust accounts of racial equality in the criminal justice system. Remember, this is more than any other thing that they measure with, right? It's the Christian nationalism that comes through. Pause for a second. If you have a chance and you're white, get Robert Jones' book, White Too Long. He tells the story of white Christianity in the United States and its ties with white supremacy historically, institutionally, and I've just taught a 5-week course at our seminary on this. Our theology is very friendly to white supremacy. Let me give you just one example. If you think that Jesus' purpose was to die so that people could be forgiven of their sins as individuals, then an issue like racial justice or poverty is no longer a moral issue because it's not an individual issue. What Jones showed, this is terrifying to me, is on polling data, he's a sociologist too. If you measure the attitudes of black Christians, the group in the country whose opinions are the most opposed to black Christians are white Christians. All of us. White people who don't go to church are not nearly as far away from our black neighbors in our public attitudes. The more we go to church, the worse we get. And yes, white evangelicals at the far end of that, but not so far from the rest of us. More likely to believe that racial equality is due to the personal shortcomings of minority groups. More likely to report being very uncomfortable with interracial marriage and transracial adoption. That second one, actually, more likely to hold anti-immigrant views, more likely to fear refugees, more likely to oppose science and science education in schools, mask. Believe that men are better suited for all leadership roles while women are better suited to care for children and the home. This one is fascinating because over the past couple of years, Southern Baptists have been fighting each other fiercely over two issues. Over some in the denomination, they voted not to do it, but it was close. There was an attempt to get the denomination to condemn critical race theory. It is prohibited to teach critical race theory. By the way, it's not a thing you can teach. I've read deeply in the area, rely on it a lot. It's a field of research. You're not allowed to teach it in any of the 6 Southern Baptist seminaries. The other thing they've been fighting about is women talking out loud in church, teaching. Social scientist Evan Stewart from the University of Minnesota writes, people who are high in PRE, public religious expression, like wearing a cross on the lapel, or a t-shirt, or having the sticker on your car, tend to express intolerance toward groups they dislike, whatever those groups may be. So, finally, why I'm concerned about it. I wouldn't be so concerned if it was just about religion. Wouldn't be so concerned if it was just about theology. This might not go well soon. I'm concerned because Christian nationalism is profoundly authoritarian. Founders of Moral Majority talked about, getting people out to vote. And this Paul Weyrich guy, on the record saying, we don't want more people to vote. When you change a society, you get a few people are activated while the other people don't care enough to vote. The attacks on voting rights, especially for young people, especially for people of color, Christian nationalists have no problem with. On January the 6th, 2021, a lot of Christian nationalist symbolism at the Capitol of the United States, inside and outside. Within fundamentalism and evangelicalism, if you're not a part of that movement, you would be surprised how much that movement revolves around the authority or authoritarian nature of ministers. But I remember visiting a church in the movement years ago, just sort of sneaking out on a Sunday to see what it was like. And the worship service began. It was January of a certain year. I've got good news for you. Bush won. And I thought, how do I reach the IRS right now? and then later the pastor came out on the stage and said, well, I want to share with you, it's the first Sunday of the year, I want to share with you my vision for the church. And he followed that with, so we'll all be on the same page. Tell me how it goes, Megan. In the Southern Baptist Convention, there's been a massive scandal about sexual misconduct covered over by the executive board of the denomination. Major pastors and seminary presidents who covered up or performed sexual misconduct, and the denomination's refusal to investigate it. Whitehead and Carey write, this brand of religious nationalism appears to be unmoored from, remember they are evangelicals, unmoored from traditional Christian ideals and morality, and also inclined toward authoritarian figures. So you create an environment where people identify as a tribe, where only certain sources of news and information count, that generates its own media and social network, and that believes that God has called it to take dominion over the society. you have a movement large enough to break democracy? Not a majority, but majorities don't break democracies. And repeat questions. And thank you.
You touched on this, and I'm wondering if you can expand on a little bit more. One thing that was so noticeable to me were the number of good Christian people and Christian leaders like clergy and so forth who would rally around our former president who had a slightly tarnished track record. Okay, kind of made me look like a saint. I couldn't understand, I couldn't come to some kind of understanding of why all these good Christian people could ignore his personal ethical principles. Yeah, how can, is there a hypocrisy in there? I mean, how do you understand the lack of any kind of a moral principle?
Thank you for that. Do I need it? No. I never need it. So, two parts. I couldn't include everything. But when Barack Obama was president, and when Hillary Clinton was running for president, if you asked evangelicals, should the president be a moral person, does that matter? A strong, over 70%, maybe 80%, I don't remember, majority said yes. When the same question was posed while Donald Trump was running, you were in the 30%. In other words, yes, they changed their mind when it was their guy. But the other part is, I was talking about white theology. When I grew up in Alabama, and it's still true, you go down there, someone will say, bless some of you heard me use this line in class, he's a good Christian man, is what they'll say. And I learned that means he hasn't been caught. What I mean is, he hasn't gotten caught doing something with his pants off. Maybe he hasn't gotten caught stealing money. It doesn't mean anything about whether he contributes to the welfare of the community. It means what he hasn't done. And if he does one of those things, then in that theology, and there's a degree to which I believe this today, in that theology, if he goes to Jesus and says, I'm sorry, then clean slate. And they preach it that way, clean slate. The problem is you can have a clean slate every week in that theology. And so those are parts of that movement that bear in on the question you're asking. The other is, I'm sorry, but they did rationalize Donald Trump. They compared him to the Persian king Cyrus. Cyrus was not an Israelite or a Judahite, right? He was a Persian king. But the book of Isaiah calls him my anointed one, or Messiah, because Cyrus was going to send the Judahites back to Judah. And the argument was, he doesn't have to be a good man. He just has to do the good things. Oh, hi.
I've been thinking about this for a while, and it seems to me, and you kind of brought it up, that the same people that are so worried about Sharia law and the Muslim law are attempting to do some sort of a far-right Christian Sharia law in this country. And that, like I said, that scares me.
It scares me too, right? And I mean, you see its effects. What I would say is you see some of that slide with the sheep and the lions, right? The notion of religious freedom functions in a particular way in Christian nationalism. It means we can do whatever we want to do without regard for how it affects other people. So we can discriminate against LGBT people. We can discriminate against women. If a woman who teaches in one of our schools gets pregnant and she's not married, we can fire her and not have any repercussions with employment law or anything like that. And, you know, I say this, the New Testament isn't always consistent, but when you encounter the language of freedom in the New Testament, is the freedom to sacrifice yourself for the welfare of others as Jesus did. It is not a self-interested freedom. And I'm convinced they literally do hard intellectual work to redefine that. People get paid a lot to do that work.
Thank you very much for all this. What you're saying reminds me a lot of a book by Robin Myers called Saving Jesus from the Church. Do you know that book?
I just, the title made me giggle. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there hope for us?
I mean, I believe in the church, and I don't mind saying I love Jesus in the same way I did when I was 15. I believe in it. I'm very frightened. There will always be faithful folks who will find community and build community and practice love and justice. But one thing that I've learned more in the last year and a half than even before is whenever there's a totalitarian movement in a society, there are a shocking number of people who, for access to power and money, will say any damn thing. And a lot of them are in the church. So what we need to learn how to do is have a conversation with people we care about, we work with, or in our family, or whatever, and not have direct confrontations with them. Don't argue over Thanksgiving. It never works. But just keep tugging on that string. Just keep pulling out the threads of why what they're doing doesn't hold up. I'm convinced that's part of our chance. The other part of our chance is mobilize politically.
One of the things, I've been doing some reading around this for the last couple of years, and one of the things that I've been seeing is that there's a direct line from pre-Civil War church to the mega evangelical and white nationalist churches. That you're talking about race, but it's not just from civil rights. I mean, it's from before the Civil War.
No. And Robert Jones in that White Too Long tracks some of this. One thing I realized reading John Faya's work, he wrote a book on why white evangelicals supported Trump, was that John is a northern evangelical and I'm a southern evangelical. And those are different experiences. In the South, Baptist and, Presbyterians were Baptists, they just didn't get real wet. You know? I mean, it was a default culture, right, that upheld slavery and segregation. Whereas in the North, those kinds of Christians were marginalized and more radical than them. And we have seen that play out. Betsy DeVos, for example, comes to mind. Extremely radical person and a classic northern evangelical.
You on lift, resident atheist.
Sorry, I was busy all afternoon.
So you spoke a little bit about how there is a large group of Christians who speak about something, and rather than marginalizing them, to own them, to bring them into the fold, so to speak. How?
Well, I didn't mean to necessarily bring them in a way of saying, oh, let's get close. What I meant is, it's so easy to say they're not real Christians. What authority do we have to say that? Everything in that movement has its origins in part of Christianity, right? To say, I resist your understanding of Christianity. I think your understanding of Christianity is dangerous and harmful. But not to say that's not Christian. Because that I get to make that call. You have, yes.
Since you wrote a book on Revelation, and it seems to me not too many years ago, there was talk of segments of Christianity who believed we are in the end times. Do these people believe we're in the end times? And if so, does that have anything to do with what they're doing?
Many do, or say they do. But one of the things you notice about this movement is how often the assumptions of this movement become sort of the default understanding of what Christianity means in the United States. Like if the news media wants to ask a Christian, what do you think about this? They're not going to ask Steve. They're going to ask a fundamentalist big church pastor, right? And so in public opinion polling in the United States, depending on who's asking, you get shockingly high percentages of Americans who will say, I think we're like over 50%. What I don't know is how serious people are when they say it. I've been in churches where I heard preachers say, you know, talking about a totally different subject, well, you know it's this bad because we're in the last days. And I'm like, you know, do you believe that, or you just have to say it a certain number of times every Sunday? And really, I don't know. But what I can say is when there were Christian bookstores, the biggest section was Bible prophecy.
I'd like to ask if I could share 2 anecdotal stories.
Ask him.
40 years ago, last month, I was called to serve a congregation here in Reading. Go up 2 blocks to 9th Street, turn left, it's 5 blocks up there. It's no longer there, it's now an Hispanic congregation, and they are thriving, which is wonderful. My music director's daughter had a divorce and remarried a wonderful man who made her laugh. And he was full of energy and love and past Roman Catholic that he hated. And then he encountered this guy named Pete Peters from Idaho. And he was telling me how wonderful this guy was with the true gospel. And I thought, he's going off the end. He worked for a nuclear power plant in New Jersey. He was expecting race war any moment. He showed me his weapons in the basement, which were all illegal. And I thought, he's really going off the deep end. No, he was part of the stuff that was happening all over the country that has grown to be what it is. Scariest man I ever met, because he lost his sense of humor. He treated his kids with a whip. And he didn't love anybody anymore. It was all about defend yourself. The grace was he died and freed his wife. Second one has to do with a family conflict. I have a twin brother, and we are as different as night and day. And
He's like, no.
last month, my Uncle Paul died, and at the service I was talking about, I'm so glad what's happening with the investigation of the January 6th insurrection. And his comment was, yeah, but they haven't done anything about the blacks in Seattle. Which is exactly, and he comes out of the very fundamentalist tradition in terms of how he sees the world. And it breaks my heart, and there's no talking about it. And we live it all the time.
I wonder how many, I'm not gonna ask you to raise your hands. How many of you have someone you're close to whose personality has changed over the past few years in response to this? I have. You know, social psychologists will tell you, and I believe it, that if you want to know why somebody does or believes what they do, and we think it's like, why do they think that? It doesn't make sense, it's not rational, it's not this and that. A sociologist is going to say, who are the people in their life that give them meaning and security? Right? that the people who, if I changed my mind about this and was public about it, how many family members would I lose? What would happen if you care about church, in your church? What would I lose? And it's hard to change your mind in those circumstances. And so, you know, one thing, and I think this is a good thing, but it's dangerous right now. A lot of the churches we're talking about are really good at what we would call socialization. Right? You're in the building of the church 4 or 5 times a week. You play basketball there. You go to a club there. Some churches have gyms. You work out. And you know, all of that. And so you build this network. And of course, this is why there are all these little Christian academies doing this. When you get into the movement, it has its own tendency to radicalize you. And that can be good. Like, I think our church I go to, should do better at building social networks. But it's just as dangerous as it is healthy. Right? So I'm sorry to hear those stories, but I imagine, you know, that if you dug deep, you'd find out, you know, who are they hanging out with, where are they getting, you know, what are they talking about? Over here.
Here.
Oh!
It's me. So I have my own kind of experience and theories on some of this.
Yeah.
And we've talked about it in the past, you may or not remember, but in my little pocket of existence in ministry and where I grew up, I have a lot of experience around what I now call the myth of the Pennsylvania Dutch work ethic, or independent work ethic, specifically linked to agriculture and coal mining and those things. And there's a strong connection to all of this, especially, I mean, so that's very regional, but in other pockets of the country I've seen it, white rural poverty. Anything you'd like to say to expand on that, how that, the manipulation of that, the fears around that, again, who they trust or look up to, and how that connects to this. I'm sure you've come across that.
Best I understand, it's complicated.
Yeah.
So, on the one hand, there's global research that shows when you have widespread economic inequality and low social mobility, in other words, it's hard to move up, and up is way out there. Trust in democracy and resentment go up, right? So yes. On the other hand, if you go to the churches we're talking about, or if you look at the January 6th people, you know it costs $60,000 to buy a nice truck. These people were not poor or oppressed. What I do think is a lot of people have social networks that are narrow. And so my dad was, as far as I know, because he will not speak to me. But as far as I know, talked with him in January 2021, and he just let slip. You know, he was convinced the election was stolen. And I think the reason he believes it, besides that he trusts some news sources, not others, is his whole world is white. Right? His whole world is people like him who, and what he would tell you, and I'm not sharing this to vent about my relationship with a dad, buy me a beer. But he grew up very humble North Alabama, went to Auburn, worked his way through college, got a graduate degree in engineering, made a hell of a lot of money, and worked for it. And when we had that conversation, I said, Dad, what was your tuition at Auburn back in the 60s? Because the United States funneled everything into higher education at Penn State, Auburn, Texas A&M, Purdue, you know, to generate all these scientists and engineers. And he got wealthy off of that. Sure. Did he work hard? Yes. Did my kids have the same opportunity? No. No, I'm paying student loans for them. I'm not resentful, but what I'm saying is, you have a group of people, it's just their world, and they assume that that's what everybody should think and do. I think that's where you get the Pennsylvania Dutch thing, of they just don't have experiences that are different than.
If you want to read something really excellent about income inequality, there's a book called The Spirit Level. Came out about 10 years ago. Two researchers from England who study state to state and globally, and it'll blow your mind.
I'm wondering, have you heard of something, a blog, conspiracy theory blog called Christian Underground Journal?
Pardon me? Where's my pen? No.
My nephew in Florida is very involved with this Christian Underground Journal.
Is it scary?
Well, what I read is turns me off totally, but you know, that's what he thinks is wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you.
Question
Oh, you
back
had a
here.
question here, Steve. I just, okay.
Well, who's next? Who else?
Oh, you're fine. Okay.
Emmanuel UCC has a book club, and we just, in February for Black History, finished reading, and I moderated our session. Don Lemon's book, This Is the Fire.
Oh,
Are you familiar with
I
it?
didn't know he had a book.
He has taken the James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. It's not a difficult reading book, but he intertwines a lot of his biographical and his genealogy with historical facts. And it is an excellent, Jean's in the midst of reading it, you need to read this. And some of the things that are brought out, we didn't have that in our history books. And I am a history major.
Right.
And I taught American history for a short time before I went off into library work. But it's amazing. I mean, we didn't know about Tulsa and that kind of, but I would recommend the book to all of you.
I will thank you, Vivian. There have been some wonderful books written to sort of unpack the racial history. From a theological perspective, a black evangelical or former evangelical named Jamar Tisby wrote a book called The Color of Compromise that goes all the way back to Jamestown. And I take it Don Lemon made too in that work.
Well, his whole background, he comes, he's from Louisiana, went to LSU.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But, you know, he figures, you know, he was the product back then of a plantation owner and one of the slaves, which is white. You know, it is just amazing, because that was part of our TV listening from it, you know, and we feel like he's a brother, and to really hear how he became what he is fascinating.
You know, how these misunderstandings and divisions about an issue like race, for example, I mean, this is just a personal story. I think it was my 20th class reunion. My high school, public school, Alabama, 20% black. There were two races, black and white. And because I was an athlete, I had a lot of interaction with black friends. We went back, we've stayed in touch. You know, we had moments in high school that I thought were very close. And almost without exception, they didn't come to the reunion. And I noticed, but we had a great time. My friends and I, we decided to go to a bar after to continue the evening. I get to the bar, and you know who is there? My black classmates are having their own reunion. And that's one of the most educational moments in my life. Now, we hugged and kissed and slobbered on each other, and it was all, but I grew up there, and I didn't know the truth. I still don't, by the way, but I got a little introduction.
I've got a couple of things in the back of my mind, and I think we sing our faith as much as we proclaim it in our actions. Probably sing it more forcefully than anything else, and the words are sometimes very offensive. How do we get beyond that? How do we make a change from some of the favorite hymns of past generations to our current generation, maybe singing Spirit of Gentleness? We just, it's like living in a cement mixer, and how do you get the two sides to blend?
I was doing an accreditation visit at another seminary several years ago, interviewing the president, who was brand new and a well-known Southern seminary, first black president. And we were just talking, and he said, "I don't want to hear about diversity anymore." He said, "I want to hear about equity. Equity. I want to hear about justice." And in the class I just taught, we had some students from a couple of black denominations who talked about white denominations that wanted to reconcile with them and bring them in. And a couple of our black students said, "We don't want that. We have autonomy, we have power." So I'm not really asking how we can all be together right now. But what I am asking is, when we ever get to go out, if you're not going out yet, who are you going out with? What are you doing to build relationships of accountability with people who are outside your world? Because it's not about being together, it's about power and access to power and vulnerability. And you know, when he said that, it was like, I've just been quoting him for 5 years. Just like a little shock of electricity, because at Lancaster Seminary, we always would say, how do we welcome people? Sorry, I'm preaching on this. You know, trying not to cuss. Welcome is wrong. Welcome means I own it, you can come. It doesn't mean we own it together. Right? And as long as we're trying to hold on to that center of where we're comfortable and how we work, I'm kind of radicalized on this. I'm not interested in that if power and intimacy and time and access aren't being broken down. And I'm sorry to get so fired up about it, but it's...
Last question.
Yes?
I'm just musing about the economic situation. And I think that when you have this wide wealth gap, which we're seeing get aggravated in this country, that in itself is anti-democratic fertile field. The other thing is that the prosperity gospel, I believe, is something that Donald Trump grew up in, and that was probably okay to start with. It got unmoored because it lost its ethical thing, and it's not only now that I can have more money than you, and that's all right, but it's I can keep getting it and getting much more than I ever need. The interesting thing is, of course, is that we have the TV pastors in this country who have raked in millions of dollars. And now on the scale, we see how the former president can finagle some kind of whatever he puts out that is people just start sending in the money. It's pretty much like the TV preachers have done all these years, and now it's from the former president. Just thoughts.
No, well, I'm going to treat that like it was a question. Sure. We've known each other. So, when I said a minority can be dangerous, when you think about, the political analysis on this, and I am not, I vote Democrat at some time, but I'm not a partisan Democrat. Like, I'm not proud of it. I have my own issues. But our politics are so thinly sliced nationally, right, that if folks like, say, Peter Thiel, super billionaire, who has said, I think democracy is incompatible.
And thank you, Greg, for an outstanding and important presentation. We are indeed living in scary times, and I really appreciate your presentation from the theological and cultural and psychological perspectives. And there are so many issues here, and we'll face them as we go along. So I appreciate your coming to us and raising these questions for us. Next month, our presenter will be Diane Seaman-Poitier on past life regression therapy. Some of you may know that over 70% of the world's population believes in reincarnation and its effect upon present lives. And Diane is a therapist, and we'll be talking about regression therapy and how that works. So we invite you to come for that. Also, a reminder, the presentation by Greg tonight will be on YouTube, thanks to Steve. And look for it, and if you want to take notes more copiously, it'll be available for you to do that. Just a reminder that sign up if you're already on our mailing list. You don't need to, but if you want to be on our mailing list and get the postings for not only Spirit on Tap, but for Soul Cafe and Contemplative Spirituality, put your name and your email address there. Also, we welcome contributions to cover our incidental expenses. We're grateful for the DoubleTree, but we do have expenses beyond that. So thank you for your contribution, and there are baskets there. We're going to be looking at programming for our next season, so if you have suggestions for presentations, just let me know about them, and we'll consider them for forever. Steve, Bob, anything else that you have?
Just one thing.
Yeah.
If you're an audible learner, as opposed to a visual one, White Too Long is available on Audible. I listen to it myself on Audible. So if you're cleaning your room, you can still listen and get the gist.
Thank you very much for your attendance tonight, and appreciate your coming. And thanks again, Greg.